Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. On this hot evening for a planning committee meeting, a couple of housekeeping announcements. There is no fire drill planned this evening. It's a shame. If things get hot, we might feel like a fire drill. So if the alarm goes off, it's probably the real thing, or at least the circuits have got overheated. And the Democratic Services Officer will ascertain the situation and hopefully come back and tell us a safe route out of the building, assuming there is one. Now, we will be webcasting and recording this meeting like almost all of our meetings. May I ask if anyone else is intending to record the meeting? That's not to stop anyone, that's just so we know. No? I can assume that that's not taken place then. Move on to the agenda for this evening. Item 1, apologies for absence. Councillor Clark and Councillor Vizard. Substitute members, please. Councillor Hastie for?
Councillor Vizard.
For Councillor Vizard. And I assume there isn't a substitute for Councillor Clark. Naughty, naughty. Right, notification of visiting members. So if you could tell us your name and what item you're here for.
Councillor Perry for agenda item 14 and 18.
Thank you very much. Councillor Newton, please.
I won't keep you guessing. It's the items in respect of land north of Bicknell Wood. Thank you, both of them.
16 and 17, thank you very much. Any other visiting members? I don't see any. Items withdrawn from the agenda. We do have a number of those this evening which will be, well, not withdrawn but rolled over to the adjourned meeting next week. Items 13, Mid-Kent Roofing Yard, Forstall Lane, Harwich. Item 20, Lewis Court Cottage, Green Lane, Bolton, Monchelsea. Item 21, Bredhurst Garden Centre. Item 24, The Willows, Buckman Lane. Item 25, Land at Valley Park School, New Cut Road. If anyone's here for those items, they will be being dealt with at the adjourned meeting next week. Which brings me neatly on to the date of the adjourned meeting, which there will be, obviously, which is the 24th of August at the same time and in the same place. Item 6, any business the Chairman regards as urgent, including the urgent update report as it relates to matters to be considered at this meeting. We do have urgent updates this evening, members. Is it agreed we take those items? Thank you. Item 7, disclosures by members and officers. Any disclosures? Councillor Prendergast first of all.
Chairman, do you wish me to disclose the allegation made against me?
No, I shall deal with that when we come to the item on the agenda.
Thank you.
Right, Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. Procedurally, because we have items carried over to the adjourned meeting, they're still part of this meeting, so therefore I really need to declare any potential interest now. So in that case, in relation to item 25, Land at Valley Park School, New Cut Road, I need to declare that I am a member of Woodlands Ward. I am the member for Woodlands Ward in Boxley Parish, but I've taken no part in any discussions in relation to this application. I was also a founder trustee of the Vinters Valley Trust local nature reserve on the adjoining site, and also, as you were, an old boy of Vinters Boys School. And my daughter currently goes to Valley Park, so I've got quite a few, but none of them actually exclude me from speaking or voting, I understand. Thank you.
I'm glad you didn't list all your connections, Councillor Harwood. We'd be here all night. Councillor Cox.
In a similar light, I'm a trustee of Vinters Valley Trust, and my children go to Vinters, or Invicta, but I haven't spoken about, I intend to speak about.
Councillor Munford first, I think.
Yeah, just rolled over item 20, Lewis Court Cottages, Bookman Chelsea. I'm chairman of the parish council. Take no part in any planning meeting, so I will still speak and vote.
And last but certainly not least, Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a disclosure that I'm actually the chairman of Harwich Parish Council, and there is an item number on with the glasses. There we are, 23. That application seems to have been going on forever, way before my time in the parish council. So I would like to be involved with that one tonight.
Just to be clear, I think that application involves a member of the parish council, does it not? Am I correct in saying that for clarification?
Quite possibly. I don't know.
Just so members know what the point is there, okay? Right, moving on, item 8, disclosures of lobbying. Well, we're going to take those with the items on the agenda, I think, as there are so many of them, and otherwise we'd be here all night. Item 9, to consider whether any item should be taken in private because of the possible disclosure of exempt information. There are no items this evening that require that, as far as I'm aware. So everything will be taken in public, both this evening and during the adjourned part of the meeting. We now move on to minutes of the meeting of the 27th of July, item 10, pages 1 to 7. Are there any corrections to these minutes that have been previously circulated? In that case, can I sign them as a true and accurate record? Agreed. Thank you, members. Item 11, presentation of petitions. Do we have any petitions? We have no petitions. Good, that'll make things quicker. And item 12, deferred items, page 8. Any update on deferred items? Right, no update on those, so that's handy. Well, of course, just to note that one of the deferred items is, of course, on the agenda this evening, which is the Staplehurst Cricket Club. So that is an update, I suppose. Right. We move to the actual report of the planning officers, and we move to our first item for consideration this evening, which is item 14 on page 16, continuing onwards. If you'd like to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. This application is for the Three Sons in Parkwood Lane. The current application is for the stationing of 2 mobile homes, 2 touring caravans and a utility block. In terms of location, the site is located on the west side of Parkwood Lane, just to the north of Parkwood, which is an ancient woodland. The borough boundary with Tunbridge Wells runs along Parkwood Lane. The site itself is not in an area at risk from flooding, but land around about 50 metres to the north is Zone 3. The map provided on page 31 of the main agenda shows the status of various other planning permissions which relate to this site and neighbouring sites. In terms of the site itself, the access road from Parkwood Lane runs along the top of this image. There are 2 touring caravans proposed on the northern part of the application site, with 2 mobile homes to the south, with the utility block just to the south of the mobiles. Site A, as annotated on this plan, is a lawful Egyptian travel site approved under application 130466, and that's for 1 mobile, 1 tourer utility and 2 stable blocks. B, of course, is the application site, and C was approved by members in May this year for 2 mobiles, 3 tourers, stable block and day room. The shaded area at the bottom of site B is a buffer strip for the adjacent ancient woodland, which is to the south. This image is of the utility block. It's on a concrete base, includes a toilet, utility area and a storeroom. The building is 9 metres long, 3 metres wide, with a roof ridge of 3 metres. In terms of the photographs, this photograph shows the entrance to the site from Parkwood Lane. This again is from the entrance to the site, looking west. In terms of the site itself, this image shows the utility block and one of the touring caravans with the ancient woodland visible in the back of the image. A further image of the site itself with the utility block on the right-hand side and Parkwood Lane over to the left-hand side of this image. This is of the access track looking east. Again, from the access track looking into the site, with the main part of the site just through this gateway. And a further image of that entrance. This is a view looking from Fritterton Road towards the site. The main agenda actually includes an appeal statement that covers the three sites, the three sites A, B, and C, and an enforcement appeal. That's granted permission for gypsy and travelling accommodation on these 3 sites. That permission has now lapsed, hence why this current application is actually put in. The officer recommendation is to approve. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. In a couple of minutes, we will move to the public speaking part of this evening. But before that, I'll ask the legal officer to just briefly outline how the public participation will work this evening. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a short announcement for members of the public, and in particular those who are speaking on any item this evening. As you've just heard, the item is announced by the Chairman, and then the Planning Officer introduces the item. The Chairman will then call the speakers. When you hear your name called, please can you come forward to the table in front of you and take a seat. To speak, press the middle button. You do not need to hold it down. The button will turn green, and the ring around the mouthpiece on the microphone will turn red. When you will have 3 minutes to speak, and you'll see your time counting down on the screen in the corner behind me, to my right, to your left. At the end of the 3 minutes, I'll tell you when your time is up. Once you finish speaking, please press the middle button again. It will turn white and return to your seat. You may hear some of the speakers this evening referred to as visiting members. They are members of the Council, but they do not sit on this committee. They also have 3 minutes to speak, but they have no right to vote on any of the applications. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first speaker this evening is Councillor Sharp of Staplehurst Parish Council. If you'd like to come forward, you have 3 minutes. If you press the grey button. I'm sorry, no material can be given out during the meeting. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Right. So Staplehurst Parish Council recommends refusal for the following reasons. In regards to this application, I must refer to planning application 120557 that was originally granted, subject to a number of conditions including time limits. My understanding is that this was for a specific family in need and that the application applied only to them for a short period of time. Since then, the applicant has changed and the definition of gypsy has changed. Application 15504557 sought to remove these conditions but was refused. Those conditions not being met left the site operating without valid permission. The current application 15510210 is now for a different family for a utility stable block and 4 homes, 2 mobile, 2 touring. There seems insufficient documentation to support this application and it should therefore be withdrawn on this basis alone. Neither does it clarify the travelling status of the proposed residents, why doubling the number of caravans agreed by the planning inspector can be justified, nor address how the planning inspector's conditions will be met. It is unclear how the applicant complies with the criteria required to be defined as a traveller gypsy under the planning policy for traveller sites, or even who exactly owns a site. The application seems slipshod and imprecise. For example, the description of the proposed access and planting strips. It's disappointing to note that Mid-Kent Environmental Shared Services did not visit the site, documented serious concerns about the supply of potable water, disposal of foul sewage, manure storage disposal and runoff, and yet raised no objection to the application. Local residents have presented a high volume of quality comments reinforcing concerns about the serious issues as follows. The unsustainable location, the over-intensification of the site, the overwhelming of the settled community, the failure to address concerns about highways, drainage and utilities. In addition, the site is not included in the draft local plan or Staplehurst neighbourhood plan. The area is designated as a special landscape area in the Low Weald and is designated as a landscape of local value in the emerging local plan. The site is not only in open countryside, but also is away from existing settlements. Accordingly, they are in a location where new sites should be very strictly limited. I can't envisage MBC wanting to support the loss of valuable landscapes or damage to other irreplaceable assets such as ancient woodland. The location is unsuitable for gypsy and travel development due to visual harm and ecology issues. See MBC's sustainability appraisal in 2014. I believe I'm correct in saying that the need for pitches by 2031 has already been achieved. And so the need to provide pitches cannot be an overriding material consideration in this case. It is the request of the Parish Council that due to the planning history of the site being very involved, Maidstone Borough Council should at a very senior level investigate the whole area in a coordinated way and avoid applications being dealt with in a piecemeal manner. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Well done. We now move to Councillor Staples of Frittenden Parish Council. Yes, I think it is, Councillor. Is it?
Oh, okay. Sorry, with the sunlight and slight colour perception, I hadn't picked that up. Okay, I'm Anthony Staples, and I'm Chairman of Frittenden Parish Council, which is obviously outside your borough, but as was pointed out, the boundary runs along the middle of Parkwood Lane. And as I'm sure you'll have seen, there have been a number of objections lodged on your portal from Frittenden residents, which I think indicates the concern there is in my parish. I want to avoid repeating some of the things which Councillor Sharp has already said, and in fact she's covered a lot of the issues which are of concern to Frittenden residents. We ourselves submitted an objection as a council in January 2016. I think one of the points which hasn't been highlighted is the fact that the site floods, although that's been refuted by at least one of the reports submitted to the portal, it does flood, I can assure you, having known the area for over 40 years. Highway access, the pictures which were taken make it look very, well, they're sort of estate agents' pictures. They would suggest that you've got plenty of access. In fact, to get caravans loaded onto that site, fencing on the opposite side of Parkwood Lane had to be cut to enable the vehicles to move in. It's a very narrow lane. We've covered the issues of foul drainage. Proximity to ancient woodland, the plan there shows a strip but in fact it is not the requisite 30-metre strip that should separate that development from Park Wood, the ancient woodland. That clearly brings ecological issues, as well as the problems of drainage, which Councillor Sharp has already referred to. The development isn't compliant with either national or local policy, particularly in the light of the need for members of the Gypsy and travelling community to establish their itinerant status to sustain such a development. There's also a lamentable lack of detail on the plan which has been submitted. So altogether, we were very unhappy about it, but we're also unhappy because of the history of the total area, where there are now about 60 people living in an area which had no caravans, permanent or touring, until about 2005. There's a history of entry of caravans onto the site, retrospective applications, failure of enforcement of conditions, failure of enforcement of the existence where the placing of caravans has been refused. And that is causing considerable annoyance to people in my parish, as I'm sure it is to Staplehurst. So for all those reasons, I would strongly urge you to reject this application. Thank you.
Councillor Perry.
I see Russell with his stopwatch there, so I better be quick. Right, okay. This site has a long and complicated history with various owners and a history of non-adherence to planning conditions, and there's still a query as to who actually owns the land. As the Parish Council highlights, application 504557 sought to remove the conditions that were refused. The effect has been that this site has been left operating without valid permission. I want to emphasise some key issues of concern. It seems that contravening EMV 28 is acceptable here, whereas in other applications it's given as a major reason for refusal. There's a lack of consistency. One cannot assess this application without considering the cumulative effect, which has already been alluded to. We have now arrived at a situation where the existing settled community are vastly outnumbered. There's over-intensification of the site brought about by the piecemeal manner in which these applications are considered. This application is not sustainable, as the report highlights, because it depends on private car use. In many other cases, it alone would be ground for refusal. This site is not included in either the adopted Staplehurst Neighbourhood Plan or in the emerging local plan of Maidstone Borough Council, and should be considered grounds for refusal on that basis alone. I would emphasise the following points. This is an area designated as a landscape of local value, but this seems to have been ignored. The report omits its contrary to EMV 28 and SP 17 of the emerging plan. Policy DM 16 cites that Gypsy and Traveller sites are subject to certain criteria, including sustainability and the cumulative effect. For years, the latter has been ignored, and I agree with the Parish Council that the situation now has become so serious that Maidstone Borough Council must, at a very senior level, investigate the whole area in a coordinated way and not in this piecemeal manner. It's my understanding that we've now met the 5-year target, so the argument that there's some overriding need is no longer relevant. The statement in para 7.7 is just plain wrong. It's the whole area that's been affected. The immediate settled community are dominated, and if the planning inspector were to be present in this room, I would tell him so. I would even offer to escort him to Specsavers. The sustainability argument in para 7.9 is strange. I recall on the road, up the road in Grafton Green, officers recommended refusal for a proposed housing development because of no bus service. So why is it okay here? This site is miles away from any services. There's a lack of consistency. I believe an email has been sent to you which highlights a number of concerns, which for reasons of brevity I won't go into in detail, but must be taken into consideration. In conclusion, for all these reasons, for those clearly expressed by the Parish Council, I'd ask that this application is refused on the grounds that it contravenes policy ENV 28, policies SP 17 and DM 16 of the Emerging Local Plan, and it is neither in the Emerging Local Plan or the adopted Staplehurst Naval Plan, and also for the lack of supporting detail in supporting this application. Thank you. Gosh, spot on.
Thank you, Councillor Perry. Now, I take declarations of lobbying on this application at this point. That's me as well. I think that's everyone. That's everyone. Right, and I'll draw your members' attention to the fact we do have an urgent update on the papers for this application, so I hope that members will read that. Right, Councillor Harwood, I think you indicated as I don't think we have any other ward members here this evening. So,
thank you, Chairman. I think that the principle of Gypsy and Traveller development on this site, there is not a problem with, essentially we've permitted other sites within this area, and frankly we've permitted permission on this very site, and there is not. I think an in principle reason to oppose this application. However, when it comes to detail, I think there are some big issues on this site. This site, a few years ago, was still a very green site. It still was mainly grassland. It was mainly used for horses, essentially. And interestingly, when we had the photographs the last time we discussed applications on this site, it showed the old site when it was mainly grassed and it was very damp and crisscrossed with ditches and so on. I visited the site ahead of this meeting, and the transformation is remarkable. There is significant urbanisation of the site. I mean, the glare essentially from the site, from the surfacings which are in the area, the land raising which has taken place, it's a very different location than I think we've made decisions in the past. In terms of protection of the ancient woodland, guidance from Natural England and the Forestry Commission is absolutely clear that the minimum buffer for ancient woodland is 15 metres, and we have enforced against settled community and Gypsy and Traveller community in this respect. There is clear encroachment from this site into the buffer in terms of surfacing, in terms of usages. So to my mind, it is not functioning as the protective buffer that the inspector required and which guidance requires us to require. And we cannot just skate over that. That's right. National government guidance specifically referred to within the National Planning Policy Framework. In terms of some of the fencing issues, I noticed that the report talks about the fact that now there's post and rail fencing, and that's more in keeping with the rural area. But what has been lost in order to accommodate that post and rail fencing was all the hedgerows and the other vegetation that was within the site. So, frankly, unless we have much, much tougher conditions to actually de-urbanise this, particularly this site, I think this site was the most obvious and glaringly urbanised of the plots on the site. I don't think that we can grant permission this evening, and I would like to hear the officers' view, because they, as case officers and so on, they must have noticed the transformation in this site that has occurred recently and the urbanising impact it has had. And so, frankly, if we are to permit and regularise the permission on this site, there will needs to be a quid pro quo that we turn it back into countryside.
Councillor Harwood, as many members will know, I've often been sympathetic to Gypsy applications, and like you, I don't think there's a particular issue of principle, but, there are applications and there are applications, aren't there? And clearly, this site at the moment does not comply, as you said, with what the Imperial Inspector said it should look like. it has a disproportionate impact on the countryside that it needn't have had. And my view is that can't be simply put right by having a couple of conditions put in which we will then need to enforce. It may well be that it is a situation that can be retrieved, but that requires turning this application down at this stage on the landscape issues and the urbanising impact of the development that's taken place, in my opinion. I will obviously listen to a couple of more members and the officers coming back, but I have seldom seen a more open and shut case of landscape harm, which must be given priority in this area. I don't think we need to go in, or probably should go into the other issues, when, frankly, we have a clear-cut case of landscape harm and effect on the ancient woodland, which I'm not saying it can't be dealt with and it can't be resolved and there can't be an application, but certainly not this application. And so if you are moving refusal on those grounds you effectively set out, Councillor Harwood, I'm prepared to second it here and now.
Yes, I am on the landscape harm and the impact upon the ancient woodland. I think we need a different scheme which is better landscape. I think we need to be very careful to detail, especially what our issue is. I think lots of issues have been raised. You know, some of them are valid from local parish councillors and local councillor. However, the clear grounds here is on nothing else than harm to the open countryside and negative impact upon the semi-natural ancient woodland. And I think we need to specify that we need enclosure of the application site with natural vegetation. We need the full 15-metre buffer instated with no uses in it. You know, whether I know it says it's a children's play area, but it is an urbanisation of the 50-metre buffer is just that, a buffer to protect the woodland from the likes of such uses which can disturb it. And I think then we're on very firm ground in terms of any future appeal, so that we can ensure that we do get the problems on this site rectified. And that's what's important here. We've got to, as I say, turn this site back into countryside. It is heavily urbanised, and yet it is in the most remote of rural locations.
Thank you very much. I think that's, the officers have made a note of that. Councillor Round.
I think a great deal's been said by our three speakers already. And I'm not going to repeat them because I can only endorse issues that have all been mentioned. Not to underestimate the fact that this is the local landscape, the landscape of local value. And therefore there is the visual harm, there is the harm to environment, there is the harm to landscape. But one key issue that was mentioned, that Councillor Perry certainly mentioned, was that we should, if we actually quote Policy C14, when assessing the suitability of sites in rural or semi-rural settings, rural planning authorities should ensure that the scale of the site does not dominate the nearest settled community. Sadly, this is becoming the case, and that is another reason to endorse, in my opinion.
I don't disagree with what you're saying, Councillor Round. I just think that it would not necessarily add to our chances of actually defending the appeal if we put it in those terms. I don't disagree with you, but I think that we have, personal view, I'll let the officer come back in a moment, so we have strong grounds to refuse this particular application, and we'll see whether a better one comes forward or not. If it doesn't, we will continue to defend a refusal on this. So, right, anyone else want to add anything particular? If not, I will take the officer back briefly and then move to a vote.
Well, I think it's down to whether members have confidence in terms of whether the applicant would actually submit details by way of a planning condition to actually reduce that the harm caused to the site. We do have conditions which seek a landscape scheme, and for the implementation of that scheme, I think in terms of the the buffer to the ancient woodland, the actual buffer which is shown on the photograph is, I think, around about 10 metres, and I think there's a further 4 metres outside the site. So it is there or thereabouts, the 15 metres.
I'm sorry, Mr. Ryan, good try, but as far the guidance is pretty clear. It's 15 metres, and that's the national guidance, and I'm sticking to it, and I think the members of this committee want to stick to it. I'm normally supportive of gypsy applications, but there is a time and a place and a way of doing things, and this is not the way, and the changes needed to this application are so significant in terms of layout and detail that it can't be done by condition, really. It needs a new application. And that's, or at least that's what members are saying. So I think we're clear on that. Mr. Mumford.
I can remember long hours in this chamber discussing LLVs. And so for me, this is not just another piece of countryside. It's part of our LLVs that we wish to protect. So I would ask Councillor Harwood to include that fact in his proposal. It's not just harming the countryside, it is within an LLV.
Thank you very much. That is a definite point that we do need to include. Thank you in terms of the specific harm done. Right. Is everyone clear on what we're doing? Councillor Harwood.
Just to come back on this point around the guidance around the minimum depth of an ancient woodland buffer being 15 metres, it is not just the fact that it is narrower than 15 metres and hardcore has been piled up, which causes all sorts of issues with hydrology and so on. It is the fact of the encroachment into that 15-metre buffer. It is having alternative uses within part of it, and that is not acceptable. And as I say, it is very narrow, the grounds upon which we're concerned, and it is the urbanisation and the lack of room for landscaping, because there is no landscaping in the site, and we do not have a 15-metre buffer. To my mind, that is open and shut.
Yep, absolutely, crystal, open and shut. So we're saying, I will try and put this in very simple. Councillor Harwood is proposing, and I'm seconding, that we refuse the application because of the clear and specific harm that it will do to the landscape in this area in contravention to policy ENV 28 SP7 of the emerging local plan, and in particular its effect on the landscape of local value. And because of its contravention of national MPPF policy guidelines on protecting ancient woodland. That probably can be improved in the grammar, but that's what we're doing. And one moment. Yeah. All those in favour of the refusal on those two specific grounds. Thank you. That's everyone's. It's unanimous. Thank you very much. Right. Sorry about pushing that so quickly, but it seemed quite straightforward. Item 15, page 51. We move on to land south of Sutton Road, and I believe Mr. Jarman wanted to make a brief interjection, and I do mean brief. We don't want a long war and peace.
Of course, Chairman. In July of last year, this committee resolved to grant conditional consent subject to a Section 106 legal agreement. As members will recall, this is a large, in fact, the largest housing allocation in the local plan, H110. And as members know, recently a planning inspector has found the local plan to be sound. However, it does not prove possible to agree the Section 106 legal agreement, partly due to the original terms of Planning Committee's resolution. Therefore, inter alia, I am seeking delegated powers to use the most appropriate mechanisms to deliver the topic areas resolved by Planning Committee last year, and therefore to mitigate the impact of the development. Good progress has been made recently, and the main point of detail now relates to a financial contribution to Junction 7, both for this scheme the next scheme on your papers and another housing allocation. The report also seeks the revision of the draft heads of agreement and a few planning conditions. And lastly, this report updates councillors on certain material considerations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jarman, Chair. So, formally introducing the report, this is an application for residential developments, indicatively 800 units, that was resolved to be granted consent on the 14th of July 2016. As Mr. Jarman has outlined, there have been a number of developments which the committee have been updated regarding in terms of the committee report and the urgent updates. I will briefly go through those points, but I'm not proposing to go through the application in detail, considering the context and the fact it has already had a resolution to grant consent. So the report talks about a number of issues outlined, and one small correction I'd like to mention in terms of paragraph 5.4 refers to the housing officer's comments. They're in section 7.4 and not in 6.7 as mentioned in the report. The report updates on a number of key issues, including air quality, minerals, which is also expanded on in the urgent update, the relationship with the Borton Lane appeal, the update on Maidstone local plan, again expanded upon in the urgent updates. We had the inspector's report through on the 27th of July, so quite recently there, and some detail on the section 106 heads, including the part signalisation of junction 7 of the M20 motorway. Just a couple of small changes. The scheme in itself is essentially the same as the one considered last summer. However, there is a slight change in respect of cycling, which is mentioned within the report under paragraph 2.1 on page 53, indicating off-site, change of off-site footway KH 365 to a cycleway is not achievable as the landowner would not agree to the upgrade. And secondly, in terms of bus, members will note that there is a view articulated in the report from KCC Highways that the provision of a dedicated bus route to Bearstead Station is not viable, and that has been incorporated within the report. So in summary, as Mr. Jarman indicated, this is a site allocated within our submitted local plan as supported by the inspector's report. There are a number of issues highlighted in the urgent update, including some very recent correspondence, both from Kent County Council and from the applicants, particularly on highways matters. I don't propose to go through that in detail, considering the amount of scrutiny that issue got subsequently, but it's there if members wish to refer to it. In summary, then, the recommendation remains approval subject to conditions and Section 106 heads, and I would just reiterate that officers are seeking full delegated powers in terms of those issues, conditions in Section 106s, in order to ensure all relevant issues are properly covered given the complex nature of these developments. Thank you, Chair.
Right, I take declarations of lobbying at this point. That's again, is it, Michael, were you lobbied? No, everyone except Councillor Hemsley for some reason. Right, and there, as the officer said, there is an urgent update on the report, which I direct members' attention to. Right, we now move to the public speaking part of this item, and first speaker is Councillor Taylor Maggio on behalf of Langley Parish Council. I think you know how to.
Good evening, everybody. News from the Road Safety Foundation this week that the A274 through Langley is one of the most dangerous roads in Kent came as no surprise to me, nor to the Sutton Road residents, some of whom are in the audience tonight, who have rescued seriously injured people from crashed vehicles on their doorsteps, often before the cars caught fire. How on earth can you have a 40-mile-per-hour trunk road that requires 2 lorries to mount pavement if they meet in Langley Village outside the church? Pedestrians cannot walk safely at all. Yet Langley, Ottham and Bolton-on-Chelsea are being asked to take thousands more houses in the certain knowledge that the resultant traffic will impact on the A274, the local area and the town, creating and adding to the toxic levels of air and noise pollution for Maidstone's residents. No use relying on any Leeds Langley bypass to mitigate traffic impact on the A274, even if the 70 million can be found to build it. It would take at least 10 years. Without landscape protection, a major road in a new scenic rural area sought after by developers would quickly generate urban sprawl and further huge traffic volumes in South and East Maidstone. With Maidstone and the town centre as the primary trip destination, even more traffic will be directed to the A274 from further afield, so no relief for the most dangerous road in the county or for the town with the worst air pollution outside central London. Is that what we really want for the future of our county town and the health and safety of our residents? MBC is a member of the Kent and Medway Air Quality Partnership. It has agreed that an overriding consideration will be given to ensure that the air quality in existing AQMAs does not worsen by the introduction of a development, and further, refusal of a planning application may still result if air quality impacts from a development remain, even after reasonable means to mitigate the impacts of air quality have been exhausted. To pretend that the air quality impact of all proposed development along the Sutton Road will be fully mitigated is to bury the head in the sand. Even with substantial local mitigation within the developments, the additional traffic into Maidstone with attendant extra congestion will not be mitigated. The town centre will get worse. Supposedly enhanced bus services, reduced park and ride, and a problematic and uncertain addition to bus lane will just not solve it. Reduced car parking will not reduce traffic flows, it will just give rise to an additional congested flows as drivers seek parking, and the town centre economy will suffer. I respectfully ask members of the Planning Committee to please consider, when making their decisions on the Sutton Road sites this evening. You can say no. It is not too late to stand up for the future of our borough, whatever happens in the local plan. It is the detailed planning analysis of the situation that counts. Yes, certainly. And air quality impact, which was given scant consideration during the preparation of the local plan and does not stand scrutiny. Thank you.
Mr Hawkins, for the applicant, I'm sure you know how the...
Thank you, Chairman, and good evening, members. As you can all see from the papers before you, the purpose of bringing this back this evening is to review the amendments to the heads of terms in order to allow for the Section 106 agreement to be completed. Since the resolution last year, there's been significant, and I would say very positive, meetings between the applicant and the Borough Council, as well as statutory consultees, which has put significant flesh on the bones, and which has also highlighted some necessary changes from the previous resolution. This in particular includes improvements to Junction 7 that can be delivered in a timely fashion, which is something that the developers are very keen on. It also means that the delivery of the primary school on site will be brought forward earlier than originally anticipated. Countryside Property are in agreement with all of the heads of terms as set out. We therefore believe this will ensure the development will, as a minimum, mitigate its impact. This obviously has been an interesting and contentious proposal for a number of reasons, but the fact that the application has been submitted and determined alongside the formulation of the new local plan has obviously allowed for the merits and perhaps disbenefits to be considered not just within the planning application arena, but also to be considered by an independent examiner. As you can see from your papers this evening, Mrs Cooper has written a further letter in response to the highways matters, and the examiner listened to evidence from both Maidstone Borough Council and Kent County Council and concluded that these sites were in a sustainable location, although mitigation would be required. Again, this is mitigation we've agreed upon. The current position is therefore that an independent examiner has found this to be an acceptable site, and Maidstone members have also found this to be so. With regards to the county's concern as to whether they've been involved in negotiations with regards to the 106 agreement, section 106, I would like to confirm that KCC have been invited to joint meetings with both Highways England and NBC, but have not attended. Members are clearly well versed in the background of these applications and also to the examination in public, so will clearly have formed their own opinion as to whether the county have been proactive in finding solutions or indeed have engaged in a manner consistent with their approach in perhaps, shall we say, less sensitive locations. Very briefly and to conclude, this is a site that already has a resolution to grant, and the local inspector has ratified this decision. It's therefore hoped that members are able to accept these minor amendments to the heads of terms and grant a further resolution subject to the heads and terms before them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Hawkins. I don't think we have any ward members here. The nearest one will be Councillor Mumford, but he isn't quite. Borough ward members, that is. So I will take Councillor Borton.
Mr Chairman, it says on page 52 that it's actually in Ward, Sutton, Valence and Langley, so I'd let Councillor Stockwell go first.
Did you indicate? I didn't think you were indicating, but... And I didn't see it. Would you like to go now?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I'm glad you realise it's in Langley. It's not too far away from here. Just to say that I totally agree with what the Chairman of the Parish Council has said, Councillor Taylor-Maggio. This is going to be a huge impact on Langley. I mean, we've got here a small parish which has grown and grown. It's a scenic area, very high-value agricultural and other land, but to put something like nearly 1,500 homes in that area, is going to have a huge impact on Sutton Road. The air quality is quite a big issue on this. I think it's bad enough now. I travel this road practically every day. It's getting worse and worse. It is severely congested, as we know. That can't get any better with the number of cars that are going to access that road on both sides, at the Ottram side and at the Langley side. And if you look on the... Oh, sorry, lost my way here. It doesn't conform with EMV 28 or EMV 32. EMV 28 is it's a departure from the development plan, and it's EMV 32 is the anti-coalescence policy, which actually seeks to restrict, development into the southeast of Maidstone. And this absolutely will. It will go on and on and on down to Sutton Valence. The parishes object to this. KCC Highways object to this. CPRE object to this. I could go on. The residents are absolutely, don't know what to do, really. It's out of their hands. It's a departure from the local plans. I think we should be looking at that. It's a huge thing on air quality. So I would really like to think that it's too much housing going here, and the air quality is going to be affected. So I would like to propose that we actually look at some of the unanswered questions in the papers and defer this application to look at again.
Is that seconded? No. And so that automatically falls. I wasn't going to say anything now, but let's be clear that there may be reasons to not grant this consent, but to argue that it doesn't comply with the local plan would be a very difficult one to make, because quite clearly we are very shortly about to adopt a local plan or not, as the case may be, but the decision is almost upon us. We have had the examiner's report, and quite clearly, this, as an allocated site, does comply with the emerging local plan. That doesn't mean we have to necessarily grant it for that particular reason, but that would be a very hard reason to use not to grant this particular application. With that said, that doesn't mean that we can't continue to discuss it, but I don't think we could argue that. Councillor Bolton, you and Nick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And of course, with the history of this site, I, for one, don't take the view that our local plan perhaps should have included so much housing down there. But what I do accept is that the situation we're in now, frankly, those issues were issues for years, as they are at the moment, years in the past, and they're not an issue for now. So whether we like it or not as a planning committee, I don't think we can turn or defer this on the principle of development points here. That's something that we can't do, whether we like it or not. And I personally agree with many of the points that Councillor Stockel has said, but I just don't see how this planning committee is in the position to be able to do so, frankly. The consequence of that is, as far as I can see, and I just quite like a one-sentence answer to this, is what would actually happen if we refuse this application? And that's a very basic question to say, but it would go to appeal and would go through. There are, as far as I can see, there are very few grounds, based on what we've got in front of us, to refuse this. I assume if the officers are, if Mr. Chan would like to come in on that, then I'll perhaps go into a bit more detail after, if that's okay.
Yes, I think that's another issue, so Rob, if you wouldn't mind.
As you alluded to, Councillor, all of these objections, air quality, scenic quality, A274 being a gridlock, were discussed in detail in the public examination. But, as you alluded to, the inspector found it to be a perfectly good site, subject to mitigation, which is really what's in front of you. And I would have thought that people who are against the development would at least want the mitigation in order to, reduce its impact. But one of them, to directly answer to your question, one of the main impacts would be, to my mind, we wouldn't have a functional local plan because we'd have to find other sites to accommodate 800 houses. And I'd remind members that this is actually an outline application, in my opinion, not an awful lot different to the actual allocation.
Having said that, I think there is one issue that does need to be considered by the committee tonight. There is an option, an either-or, for a provision of a medical facility. I think it is quite important, I'm sorry for interjecting again at this point, but I do think it's important members realise this, which could be on-site or off-site. And whilst we cannot particularly direct the CCG, I feel personally, given the shortage of medical facilities in South Maidstone in particular, it might be useful for this committee to at least indicate its strong view one way or the other.
My strong view, Mr. Chairman, would be that that should be on-site, based on exactly as you say. But accepting what you say, then in terms of the mitigation that's to come, I'm therefore a little bit disappointed to read in the letter from Kent County Council that they feel that they've been excluded from any Section 106 negotiations that have taken place so far. Now, reading the letter again from DHA, you could say that's because of the county's unwillingness to engage proactively with the Borough Council, brings me to exactly the same question I asked about 13 months ago in this chamber, I remember, which was basically I looked at the officers over there and I said, why can't you just get in a room and just decide amongst yourselves what's right? And it's clear that here we are a year and a bit on, that that's still not happened, and we're not even at the point of arguing about the details. We're arguing whether we're in the room or not, which is frankly pathetic. And to give that impression to the public a year and a bit on, that we still can't decide whether we're in the room or not, is hideous, absolutely hideous. So to my mind, I think we've got one final opportunity here to get the best mitigation that we all want. And so I'd actually like to propose deferral on not the grounds that Councillor Stockel suggested, but actually with one very simple aim, and that is to get the KCC to the table to have a proper negotiation about the Section 106 agreements and the heads of terms, because it would be unwise, and I wouldn't feel comfortable making a decision while KCC are still saying we've not been invited to the table. And I don't feel comfortable doing that, considering it is the largest allocation, largest site in our local plan. So I'd quite like to propose deferral on those particular grounds.
I think at this point I will ask the case officer to come back because...
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I would point out on the issue of KCC's involvement, the urgent update goes into a bit of detail on that first page under the heading Officer Response, and that in terms of the involvement that KCC have had. It is true that we are not including KCC as a formal signature of the Section 106 agreement. The reasons for that are outlined in the urgent update, but in summary come down to a lack of delivery of the County Council in terms of historical mitigation for the A274. That said, and I'm sure Mr Jarman would be happy to come in as well on this point, I personally would say that MDC are very keen to work proactively with the County Council to ensure maximum mitigation for the A274.
Can we, Mr Jarman, can we amend your proposed delegation to at least try and, I know it's difficult, but to try and take on board at least what Councillor Borton is saying, so that we at least, insofar as we can, because obviously it takes two parties to tango, but can we adjust your proposed delegation on Section 106 terms to take on board any of that point made by Councillor Borton?
Legally, one can. And I do agree with what Councillor Borton said. I don't think it sends out the right message. But Kent County Council have consistently, for a number of years on this application, in particular, this H110 application, have objected in principle. And in my opinion, the principle's gone now. This committee agreed the principle 13 months ago, but Mrs Cooper is still objecting to the principle. What concerns me on housing delivery is our major housing allocation. Now, I know lots of people don't like having housing here, but if this, already there's been a long delay, it's because it's such a big housing site, I'm worried we're going to fall foul of not having a 5-year land supply, which is one of the main motors, in my opinion, for trying to get an up-to-date local plan.
Councillor Borton, as this is an important point, I'll bring you back.
Yeah, thank you. So it was basically going back on what Mr Chapman said, in which I think it was unwise not to formally include KCC on this, considering their roles in the Highway Authority, if I'm totally honest, whether they've been historically difficult or not. Because basically what that's done is, irrespective of whether they've not or been slow to implement any mitigation on the A274, irrespective of that point, we have allowed ourselves to be open to the criticism that we've not been inclusive of them. And whether Barbara Cooper wants to argue about the principle of development or not, and it's clear in here that she does want to, despite that not really being up for discussion here, the fact that we haven't formally included them is a problem for me. So my proposal actually to defer is basically, I'd only like it for one cycle only, actually, to give them one last chance to get around the table. And if they don't do that, then we're going to have to make a decision as a planning committee. But until that's been the case, bearing in mind that we weren't formally including them, it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult. I wouldn't feel comfortable making a final decision tonight, to be honest.
I'm going to bring Mr Chapman back now, and I will move to you, Councillor.
Thank you. Bearing in mind the exchange we just had and the views that Councillor Borton has articulated, might I suggest that members consider an additional recommendation, which is that officers use best endeavours to engage proactively with KCC on resolving these highways matters as part of the wide delegated process officers are seeking to resolve the case as a whole.
The problem with that is that this is our biggest housing allocation. This actually, we move almost off a planning point here. This is our biggest housing allocation in the local plan, and these issues are of mitigation. These detailed issues are still being argued on now. And as a councillor, as an elected representative, as much as I trust the officers and Maidstone Council to do their job, I do feel that on our biggest sites in the local plan, the final decision must rest with councillors, because it's going to be our heads on the chopping block at the end of it. And though I do appreciate what you're saying, and I do appreciate the necessity and the consequences this might have for the 5-year housing land supply, that's why my proposal is to do this relatively quickly, because the final decision must rest here.
Councillor Mumford, then the legal officer.
I'd like to look at what we're here for tonight and the questions that are being asked of us. As far as the medical centre, I would say it should be on site, and I think the committee should insist on that. For those that are confused, Bolton and Chelsea extends right out to the Sutton Road, includes the industrial estate of Parkwood, includes Langley Park, goes right out to the buildings in the middle of the actual development you're talking about at the moment. So over half the housing is going to be in Bolton and Chelsea. Can the officer point out for me on the map where KH365 is exactly? Can you point to it? Right. It was something. It's something that we insisted on. People have spoken about air quality, transport, and all of that. I'm not happy that we just give up on cycles, and so I would like to see some endeavour to get cycle paths included in this development, if that one's not possible elsewhere. But before I let you come back at me, I'd like to know what we mean by peak hours on the buses to Cornwallis. I would suggest that is school times as opposed to peak hours. And I notice that we're not going to get the buses to Bearsted. And that is going to be replaced with a 106 contribution towards buses to, or some form of transport towards Maidstone East. My considered opinion of that is that that area is well supported with buses into town. So if we cannot relieve the problem to Bearsted Station, we've got problems to New Line Learning, where everyone's using the rat runs to get New Line Learning. We should offer alternatives. So I'm not happy to just sit here and say, we can't put a cycle path in. I want an alternative. I'm not happy that we're going to say we can't go to Bearsted, so we're going to put yet another bus into town. I think we should be looking for a head of terms that takes that somewhere else where we've got problems. And what do you mean by peak times? Do you mean school hours?
Very good questions, but I'll take the legal officer before you answer them, because he's been wanting to come in for a little while.
I think if we're just talking about the bus services, for example, and herein lies the irony, it was Kent County Council who said, we don't want the buses going to Bearsted. So we're asking us to negotiate. This is the difficulty. We've got a very complex set of sites here on the Sutton Road. It's kind of like a jigsaw. They all overlap with one another. And that's why if you look at the nature of the resolution that the officers are seeking, they're looking for the widest powers possible so that they are not necessarily constrained specifically to the section, to the heads of terms that have been put before you, but to deliver not only the development, the best quality development that they can, but also the best mitigation they can, to the extent that the third parties are wanting to engage. Now, we've heard about, for example, the community hospital or the doctor's surgeries and that. Well, it's a bit, you may express a wish that you could have an on-site surgery, but if the NHS or the CGC are not prepared to do it, they're not prepared to do it. We can't force them to do it. They're not a party to the agreement. We have, and I know that I'm negotiating the Section 106 on the Bicknor Wood agreement, and KCC, I know, have been sent a draft of the agreement. They have commented on the agreement, including the highways, and we have incorporated all their comments into that draft. So to say that we haven't engaged, they are not a party to the agreement. Sorry, I know I'm kind of directed towards you, sorry. To say that they are not a party to the agreement is correct, but to say that they have not been engaged in the process is not correct. So it's a case of how far do Kent County Council want to engage, bearing in mind that the position that they are holding throughout this process is, well, we actually don't want anything to happen here on the roads. We've been given money, but we're not going to spend it. The inspector or the examiners turned around and said, well, you guys have sat there, you've done nothing. What else are they supposed to do? We're talking about air quality. Well, we've got to get buses in. That's going to reduce the air quality. It's not going to mitigate and totally remove it. But these things have to happen, and they've got to engage in the process.
Thank you. Right. In a moment. Councillor Mumford, had you finished? I just need to check.
Yeah, I just finished, but I would like some replies to what I pushed forward.
Yes. I think, yes, indeed, I think your points are well made. And, yes, I hear what you say about the surgery, but, yes, it is important that we give a clear indication and try and press the NHS in the right direction. Mr. Jarvis.
Yeah, directly in response to Councillor Munford's two questions. Yes, the service, unfortunately, towards Bearsted railway station was found to be unviable. However, the money isn't lost in that it will go towards the new service that Arriva wished to put on to Maidstone East for the Thameslink service. So the pot of money, if you like, is not being reduced. And secondly, and very similar to that, is, again, Kent County Council didn't want to see the public right-of-way upgraded, so it was wide enough to take pedestrians and the cycleway. But so again, basically, it's now on private land, but it will be east-west or west-east access. So it's not being lost.
I think I follow that. Councillor Prendergast, you've been very patient.
Thank you. Goodness me, what an evening. I just wanted to say, we've had Mr. Hawkins from DHA talking. I just wondered if there's an opportunity here for Mr. Wright to add anything here. He may wish to say what KCC's position is. What I also need to know is, if we are going, I really have a genuine concern about air quality, and it's nothing new from me. You know, you've heard it all from me before. But if we can't meet agreement with Kent Highways on this, and we don't find a solution, and we don't do something about traffic congestion on the A274 and the air quality at the Wheatsheaf, which is 51% over current limits. I know the paper here says that the EU limits are really down to DEFRA, but we do have a responsibility as a local planning authority, and I've come across papers from a paper from a QC called Robert McCracken, who talks about the role of the local authority when it comes to planning, and he's quite clear. He says, where a development would, in the locality, make significantly worse an existing breach or significantly delay the achievement of compliance with limit values, it must be refused. Now, that's just one paper, that's one opinion. But it's something that an inspector, when considering an appeal at London Road in Hassocks, she was very clear that, what did she say? Hold on, just bear with me a second. She, when exercising the planning balance of a housing development just outside an AQMA, as this one is, she concluded that her lack of certainty with regard to air quality and human health could only lead her to dismiss the appeal. Now, that is my concern, because, you know, we can work through paragraph 14 of the MPPF and the sustainability criteria, but if you're playing with public health, then there is nothing else in the MPPF that would support, you know, playing with people's lives, because this proposed medical centre that we're looking at potentially could be full of people with respiratory illnesses if we're not careful. So I just need to know what we are going to do about this horrendous situation if we can't find a way of resolving this.
Well, I wasn't going to do my main speech yet, but I'll do it now because you've raised the important point. The point, I think, which Councillor Bolton and other people have referred to is we actually did resolve to permit an application on this site. It's an allocation in the plan. The examiner has considered all of the issues that have just been raised. So if we were to refuse this application, there would have to be something that has changed since our previous resolution to permit that overrides the fact that it's an allocated site in the local plan. The only changes that have happened is that the examiner has looked at the issue of air quality in some considerable detail and has looked at the issue of mitigation on the A274 and has fully agreed with the Borough Council's stance on those issues. Now, we individually may or may not agree with the examiner's view, but that is the view that he has clearly taken. Now, in terms of the motion that has sort of been postulated in terms of deferral, I'm not going to go into all the background of this because we all know what the background of this is, but in all seriousness, given what has happened over the last decade, the chances of a resolution appearing in one committee cycle with KCC is zero. It's less than zero. It ain't going to happen. There is absolutely no chance of that. However, there may be room for discussion if these applications and the local plan do move forward, because those will then become the facts on the ground, and then mitigation is the only strategy in play. If we refuse this application or even we defer it, we are putting ourselves in a very difficult situation. However, a very fair question has been asked about the view of Kent Highways, and I was about to say that it would be very nice. It's always nice to hear from you, Brendan, but it would be particularly nice to hear from you this evening.
Thank you, Chairman. The position of the Highway Authority has always been one of strong objection in relation to this application, largely because this is substantial growth that will have an impact on the most constrained part of our highway network. And our strong view has always been that strategic forms of mitigation are required rather than a piecemeal approach to improving individual junctions. Now, in making our formal consultation comments on the application and registering those objections, we very clearly stated that were this committee minded to go against our advice and resolve to approve the application, that we would wish to be involved in discussions on any Section 106 legal agreement. I've heard various comments referring to the fact that we've either not been willing to engage or we have engaged. I'm the Transport and Development Officer covering Maidstone. I'm the KCC Highways Officer who has reviewed the application and commented on it in some detail. Logically, I would have expected to have been involved in any dialogue that had taken place. I cannot recall one meeting that I've been invited to aside from a discussion with Highways England on Junction 7, and I don't recall ever being approached for input directly into the legal agreement. So I can only speak from personal experience, but I would reiterate at the same time that we remain willing to work with the borough to try and achieve the best mitigation package possible. Clearly, it is in our interests to do so.
In that case, I think the recommendation that Mr Chapman suggested adding it would probably be wise, because that would enable us to pursue that dialogue.
It would enable us to pursue that dialogue, but it wouldn't necessarily be the right thing to do, Mr Chairman. And that's my issue with it, for the reasons I said earlier. That's the key thing, because we're elected representatives, after all, and we've got to remember that.
I'm going to take Councillor Powell now and Councillor Spooner, and then...
Yeah, thank you, Mr Chairman. I'm going backwards. Obviously, I was quite against this application in the first place, and I suppose I could say that I've accepted it now, but that'd probably be lying. Actually, I haven't really accepted it. And I think this evening's shown a number of the reasons why. I mean, with regard to the, if I can call it, the Kent Highways bashing by this council and also some of their representatives, to be quite honest, I mean, Kent Highways never turn anything down, but they turned this down, so it's got to be a blooming good reason as to why. And you know, I mean, yeah, Mr Wright is sometimes called different things, the opposite to what his name suggests, and every time he comes to this meeting, you know, we hammer him, but tonight I think there's quite a few of us that are actually in defence. And also, when I saw that Mr Jarman had turned up tonight, I thought, yeah, there's a reason for that. There's just a couple of observations. I mean, if this were to go ahead, we've got to look at the Section 106 agreement. I mean, the money's going to be spent all over the place, but it isn't being spent on the area that's actually affected by this application. That makes absolutely no sense at all. The word responsibility was mentioned by Councillor Prendergast. We are not showing any responsibility towards the residents or the major issues that are going on with that road. I mean, this is... I mean, we've had to accept the plan. Fine, I'll go along with that now. But the Sutton Road is blooming awful, and what's gone on there, I would suggest it was irresponsible. The way that so many properties have actually been built on top of each other, and the problems it's causing with kind of local villages and whatever. I don't want to harp on about that, but this is exactly why I was sitting around this table tonight. But also, Mr Jarman actually mentioned the 5-year land supply. I would be very, very interested to know that if this development was withdrawn, what difference that would make to the current 5-year land supply.
I think you'd have to answer. I think if we defer this one for the highways grounds, we are actually talking about all three applications. I don't think we could treat them differently. So if you answer that question on that basis. All three applications were withdrawn because, after all, we are on the same highway network. We would have to defer all three.
Yes.
Because if we end up voting to defer this one, those will not be discussed this evening. You will have had a wasted journey. Mr Jarman.
Yeah, as members know, the 5-year period is always revolving every year. The point that I was trying to make, and I think you've already made this point, Chairman, is the inspector, in a public examination which lasted between the beginning of October to January, there was at least one session just on air quality. But more to the point, coming back to this to this site. The inspector didn't just say, yes, I think this site's fine. What he said was, because there was lots of objection, I think KCC objected to about 10 issues with regard to this site, he went into a lot of detail on the mitigation. I know some people are against prioritisation of buses, but it wasn't just buses. It was, as Councillor Munford pointed out, it was the cycling, it was the walk-in, and improving the junctions themselves on the A274. So it was this site subject to mitigation measures. In fact, after the examination ended, Barbara Cooper wrote to the inspector saying that she was still very much against this site. So the inspector wrote back, I think there was 2 letters, talking about the importance of the mitigation along the A274. And perhaps we haven't articulated it very well tonight. Back in July, and it's still the case, the developers, both Countryside and Bellway, are putting money on the table in crude terms to improve the A274. The big bit that's missing is the financial contribution to Junction 7. The reason why Junction 7 is an issue is because of Highways England. They want the money to improve Junction 7.
I think that's very clear. Councillor Spooner, you've been very patient.
I do apologise, Mr Chairman. I wasn't asking to speak at all. I was merely waving my hand in the air. I do apologise.
Well, that helps. Right. Okay. I think we do have to be careful to make sure I've taken everyone who wanted to speak first before I call anyone back again. Right. Councillor Prendergast.
I just wish to second Councillor Borton if he is seeking a deferral on this, because I appreciate what you're saying, Mr Jarman, that this will have a significant impact on the delivery of the 5-year. But I would rather take some time to try and resolve this than play with people's lives. And that's really important to me.
Can I seek, before we go any further, how long are you seeking to defer for?
Well, I will take advice from officers on how long they think it will take to get to this stage.
25 years, in my personal
goodness
opinion.
Me. Chairman, you say that, but Mr Chapman has just suggested that we condition that. So he must be confident that we can find a way forward. So rather than conditioning it, can we defer it, please?
No, I think we need to know how long members are seeking to defer it for before we actually discuss that.
Perhaps I can answer that as the person who proposed deferral. So my initial look, what we're talking about here is, as I said earlier, is to get to the point where KCC accept that they have been part of the discussions. And from Mr Wright's comments earlier, it's clear that they haven't been part of the discussion. So, if we end up having those discussions and we still end up at loggerheads, then yes, it might be 25 years, Mr Chairman. But in which case, he has to come back to this committee, and this committee will have to make the decision based on that fact and that fact alone. Because I'm sure there's many people, like yourself, who take the view that that agreement will never be reached, and actually agreement is unlikely to be reached, one could argue. So the length of time I suggested one cycle earlier, because it really depends when a meeting can be arranged, to be totally honest with you. It depends, it depends when that can be. It depends what issues come out of that. I don't know what will be said at a meeting that may or may not happen in the future. So it'd be very hard for me as a proposer to put a specific time frame on the deferral. I think, though, it's very clear from the spirit as to what's being discussed this evening, what members are seeking and what clarity members are seeking for officers to come back with. That's my own personal view. So I think takes as long as it takes. But the question that I haven't had answered yet with regards to the impact on the 5-year housing land supply is, can you put a, Mr. Jarman, can you put a time frame on it? Whereas if these applications, all 3 of them, were deferred, at what point do we lose our 5-year housing land supply?
Probably the immediate point of deferral, but let's find out. Mr. Jarman.
At this point in time, obviously a lot of developers still disagree with this, but my view, and SPST had a report on this, is that we have slightly over a 6-year, 5-year housing land supply. But as I keep saying, that has to be renewed, if you like, every 5 years. Because of the delays already, certainly not all 800 houses will be delivered in the next 5 years. This is an outline application. Obviously, there has to be reserved matters applications put forward. So my point about this site is that very soon, certainly within, I'd say, it's hard to pinpoint it, but say 2 years, I think we would be in a position where it would be perilously close whether or not we had a 5-year land supply.
That's quite clear. Mr. Chapman.
I just wanted to come back on the issue of deferment and Councillor Borton's points. I think from what we've heard from Mr. Wright, the County Council's position has been reiterated and they continue to have significant concerns on highways matters. That's very clear. What I'd like to say is that I made a suggestion earlier that officers use best endeavours to have a proactive dialogue with KCC to resolve those issues. Now, you've heard about the inspector's views, you've heard about the professional and independent advice on these issues. My very strong advice would be we're very happy to have a dialogue, and given historical issues, we're very keen for that to move forward quickly. If members are of a similar view, then the question is, how do we get it moving forward quickly? And I would very strongly argue that if you were to resolve to grant this evening, subject to the dialogue that we've all been talking about, that would provide the strongest basis for a swift dialogue with KCC on that matters. It gives a clear indication that this is an allocated site. The housing on this site, members will have resolved already and resolved again to agree the scheme, so KCC have to engage on that basis. If we're looking at a deferral and then a dialogue, then we're in a weaker position in terms of making that swift resolution and moving forward positively with the mitigation on the A274 that we very clearly heard some strong views about this evening. So I think we're actually all wanting to do the same thing. It's the mechanism of how we do it. And I hope I've helped move it on with that.
You've certainly helped clarify your points. However, for the reasons I said earlier, it's not politically palatable for me as an elected representative of this council to do that. And that's precisely why I'm seeking deferral, because I don't personally think it's the right thing to do, bearing in mind where we are, frankly. So I agree with a lot of what you're saying, Ms. Chapman. I really do. I appreciate where we are in the dynamics of this whole thing, but until we can actually get KCC, until Mr. Wright can come here and say, I have met with the officers at Maidstone Council, and by the way, I might not agree with what you're proposing. I've had strong objections for a long time on this, and I might maintain those strong objections, rather than coming here and going, well, actually, I've never had a meeting with you, and I've never been able to say that. Until we can get to that point, it is not palatable for me as an elected representative to give approval to the application in front of you, and that is precisely why I've proposed deferral.
Okay, members, if we do that, given what's happened, it is almost certain that these applications will be determined by appeal, because that situation is a straightforward invitation to not have that dialogue. because what will happen very clearly, and we've seen the manoeuvring that's been going on, not by county officers, but in certain quarters, these applications will never be approved if this deferral goes through today, because that dialogue will not take place, because we have seen what has happened. We know what the whole strategy has been. It's no accident that these letters of rejection always appear the day before the planning committee meeting. And the situation is very clear. If we defer, especially if we defer without a clear target in mind, in terms of date, or with a clear idea of what mitigation is actually missing, and if you look at the examiner's report, there isn't any missing, we are saying two cases say, you have got the total power to remove Maidstone Borough Council's local plan, our 5-year housing land supply, and we will be in a disastrous situation where these applications will go for non-determination. There will be an appeal, and there will almost certainly be a very disastrous outcome. So, however, that is, you know, it has been moved and seconded, and I don't think we're going to get very much further without taking an indication on that. But as Councillor Mumford has indicated, I will take him before.
Members, we've been here so many times. We went for Regulation 18. All the communities spoke. The meeting lasted 19 hours. The council then voted to put this site through onto Regulation 19. Again, it went out to public consultation and members spoke their views. We then voted as a full council to put Regulation 19 through. This application came up in outline, and we probably deferred it twice, where all the highways issues were discussed, and we had put their point of view through, which was the consultants for Maidstone Borough Council. At the time, if I remember rightly, KCC were objecting, but we didn't see the evidence. We then got up to July in 2016. And we've had the inspector, he has found this to be sound. July 2016, we then voted the outline through. The same discussions were going on then. And now you're saying, let's defer this. Let's defer this, and what we will get is non-determination. This has been decided so many times. We will probably get costs at appeal. They will go to appeal. We then put our 5-year housing land supply in jeopardy. And all the impact that will have on not only Langley, but every single parish, every single ward in our council. We've been through that, some of us. It is not a nice experience. If you feel that us, by deferring, we will get anywhere, then go for deferral. Put the public money at risk, put our 5-year housing land supply at risk, or the alternative would be to take Mr. Chapman's advice and build it into what we're looking at tonight. Tonight is not about whether this goes through or not, it's about the 106s. And that's all I've got to say. I've been on this roundabout now for about 5 or 6 years, and each time we defer it, we make decisions, and then we have the same discussions over and over again. But this time, you're putting public money at risk, and you're putting the 5-year housing land supply at risk. Take Mr. Chapman's advice.
Of course, can I just come back and...
In a minute. Councillor Harwood hadn't spoken before, and he's indicated, and I'm taking people who haven't spoken before first. If you don't mind, Councillor Baldwin. Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. I've listened very interesting and very intently to the debate, And I think the critical point here is, I hold no candle for this allocation. I mean, my view about development along the Sutton Road has long been known. We do not have a railway station nearby. It's the wrong place for a major urban extension. But we've got what we've got. As everyone knows, I have very significant concerns that I know what landowners want as our next local plan, which will take a lot more housing than our current local plan, and that is a south-east extension on steroids. So I really don't want to set us up for even, for the subsummation of Langley and so on, and the complete loss of Ottham, which will inevitably happen. I mean, as someone who's born and bred in Weavering, I know what it's like for the countryside to be completely lost, so that now you go through miles of housing estate, and it happens very, very quickly. I suggest that as the statutory highway authority, there will be engagement on tackling the air quality issue, on tackling the transportation issues, once there is clarity and there is certainty. If we muddy the water by deferral, and there are all sorts of mechanisms which could make that deferral last for a very, very long time, there is a real, real danger here in terms of the very point I mentioned about bigger applications, southeast extensions and so on coming out of the woodwork, because we will lose our ability to counter speculative developments. And there is a real planning policy danger in that. I think we cannot lose sight of the fact that this is a very big allocation. It punches a very big hole in our housing numbers very, very quickly. There is also the issue about how far along we are with the process that Councillor Mumford raised. There are things I don't like. I'm very concerned about some of the proposals for junction widening and so on downstream on the Sutton Road. They're residential communities, very pleasant residential communities in Bellway and Marion Crescent and so on, where they're all going to be substantially and negatively impacted by the fallout from some of this massive development. However, if we are to have some control over our destiny, I think we need to be resolute in moving ahead and in terms of our vision. So I think I just make a plea that we don't defer and potentially open a Pandora's box, which will get us into all sorts of problems that perhaps we did not envisage. On a very detailed issue, I think it's quite right that we should place an informative onto any resolution that we make regarding the medical centre. We have the problem in North Ward. North Ward, there's Councillor Hemsley and we're taking more housing than any other ward in Maidstone Borough, and we've got all sorts of problems as it is without that massive growth. We have had real problems in providing any community facility because there is no space. Every space is being developed. The only way I think we will get our medical facility is if it goes on essentially to a greenfield site. So I think that we should put our money where our mouth is and state that we want the centres there, and it will serve the likes of Langley and Sutton Valence and so on that also have a need. So I think we should place that on record. I again agree with Councillor Mumford about the concerns on the issue around the not putting money into a shuttle bus, and I think that's the way we talk about it. It's not about a commercial bus, it's about a shuttle bus to Bearsted Station. Because the alternative for a peak time railway journey shuttle bus to Bearsted Station is a lot more 4x4s and a lot more cars going down the Sutton Road, clogging it up, trying to get to somewhere near Maidstone East Station, or down Sutton Road or through Ottham trying to get to Bearsted Station, which is probably more likely. And I think that we should have the strength of our convictions, and we have done all the running on the transportation issues here. I think it's local residents who know about the rat runs, who know where people are going to go in terms of getting to a station. So I think we should persevere in looking at a high-quality shuttle bus to get residents from these new development areas to Bearsted Station, because I think we're on a hiding to nothing taking them down into Maidstone because it's gridlocked, and the alternative, they'll go in private cars and cause us more problems. So, you know, that, I think we need to bottom that issue out. But to move things forward, I am prepared to move an amendment that we do grant permission with the proviso of we put that informative on and we keep open the discussions on the public transport issues. I've got a very real concern from, and it's not anecdotal anymore, it is borne out by the facts. In terms of the demographic of the new residents, of the new developments in Sutton Road, car ownership is higher than the indigenous population, if you like, the population that are already living there. You just need to go to those estates, look at the numbers of cars, look at the type of cars, which are very often very large engined, very large vehicles, which tend to be just carrying one person or so. We are building a very unsustainable development. I actually think we don't pander to the 4x4s. We don't widen every junction. We don't do whatever. We actually, like in other urban conurbations, in other towns and cities, not just London and Birmingham and Glasgow, but also places like Colchester and so on, we actually have to use a bit of stick to force people to use shuttle buses, to force people to use that, because otherwise we're just going to undermine the quality of life of all the residents in our urban area, in our villages and everywhere. We can't predict and provide for the numbers of houses we're building.
Right, you've moved an amendment, which is, as in the papers, with the urgent update, plus the informative about the medical centre and reinstating the Bearsted shuttle bus in the draft 106, I believe. Is that seconded? Councillor Cox was fractionally first. As you haven't spoken yet, do you wish to speak at this point?
I think an awful lot has been said about this. I think the most important thing that we've heard from Mr. Jarman is that this works because the inspector looked at everything. Each thing, as we've heard from our legal advice, it interlocks. One thing relies on the other. The mitigation will only come forward if it's all working together. I would rather have heard Kent County Council officer present say, "That's absolutely perfect, Councillor Bolton. I can make myself available next week." But we didn't hear that. Well, I would have thought he would have said it, Councillor Stockel, but he didn't. So I would like to second Councillor Harwood. We need to press on with this because it needs to be correct. We need to get the right thing for our borough, and it will only work in its entirety.
Can I ask members and officers to try and, I know his passions run high, but to you know, try not to be personal in any of the things that we say. Councillor Round, is it on the amendment or on the previous main motion? Okay, I'll take you now.
Can we therefore ask Mr. Wright what pragmatically or practically he can do and when?
Might be difficult for him personally, but to give that without consultation elsewhere. But Mr. Wright, are you able to give us some?
Well, we're certainly ready to have discussions with officers at the borough right now. I mean, there's nothing stopping us. So I see no barriers to us working together to move the whole process forward.
Well, that's very helpful to know. Does that answer your question? Mr. Jarman, and I really must move on.
I did ask for clarity on this previously, and I believe I asked Mr. Wright when Councillor Borton asked him about getting involved in discussions. I believe Mr. Wright referred specifically to Junction 7, which, as I understand it, KCC have not asked for any contribution. Obviously not to Junction 7 itself, because that comes under Highways England, but obviously there's two roundabouts. But is Mr. Wright saying that there's been no discussions on improvements along the A274 corridor?
To be honest, I'm not sure how much this is actually adding, but Mr. Wright?
In the context of the Section 106 agreement, there has been no dialogue.
I think the situation is quite has been rehearsed. I think, well, I think I know what I think, but an amendment has been proposed and seconded. Do members need to hear again what it was? It was Councillor Harwood proposed and it was seconded by Councillor Cox to grant planning consent on the basis of the recommendations on the paper, plus the urgent update, plus reinstating the Bearsden shuttle bus to the proposed Section 106 heads of terms, and an informative relating to the strong preference of this committee, indeed the Council as a whole, for a medical facility to be on site. I think that's clear, isn't it? Right, just one moment. Yes, but that's been updated to, well, the proposal, I assume, was that Councillor Harwood had updated that to take account of the advice that Mr. Chapman had given in relation to seeking, to using our best endeavours urgently, I think might be needed to be added to that, to engage proactively, was the phrase used, with the County Council on the Section 106. So that's been updated slightly. Right, Councillor Rownley, is it on this particular point?
I'm just trying to seek a case of, well, I'm just trying to seek some clarity. I was in the belief that the deferral was proposed first before the amendment. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Exactly. That's what amendments are taken first. Votes are always on amendments to the main motion first. You're quite right. The deferral was indeed moved first. So that's why we're voting on the approval first, because that's the amendment. but quite right, Councillor Round. Right. Those in favour of the amendment to approve on the grounds set out and as amended, please indicate. Those against? Okay, right. I think we now...
Mr. Chairman, while you confer with the officer, shall I just remind members of what the motion to defer is? Good. Okay. So we are seeking to. I better find where I've technically written it down now. We are deferring to discuss with the Highways Authority the revised draft Section 106 legal agreement and the heads of terms. Now, there's been some mutter and chatter since I first proposed this about the length of time, and it was asked directly to Mr. Jarman and to Mr. Wright. So I think that might be useful, as it was asked me earlier by yourself, if we bottom that out here. Now, bearing in mind Mr. Wright has said that he could sit down straight away, in theory, and discuss what's going on, and bearing in mind the fact that you, Mr. Chairman, think it might take 25 years, I do think that we need to come to some sort of compromise. Particularly considering the impact on the 5-year land supply and the 2-year figure that Mr. Jarman put on there. Although,
just
you
stop
caught
you
me my stride, but I will give way.
Sorry to stop you, Councillor Borton, but if members agree that it's for one cycle, then there's no problem necessarily. But under the Council's own procedures, if there is an inherent risk, there is a procedure that should be invoked for a deferral for one cycle.
I was actually going to...
So it would be one cycle.
Well, hold on. I put one cycle on there before I heard the answers. Of course, which is precisely why I'm coming in now and going perhaps 3 cycles or 3 months would be a more appropriate conclusion. If it comes back beforehand, hey, great. But certainly, I think by putting that time frame as a longer period, it at least gives us a deadline to work to. And if it can come back beforehand, I think we will all be very happy.
I would seriously beg members to, at this stage, resolve to defer it for one cycle only, because if we defer this for months, I will guarantee you now that there will be free appeals for non-determination.
It was interesting you say that, Mr. Chairman, because you were actually shaking your head when I first suggested 1 month about an hour ago, and we seem to have gone full circle since then.
I was against the deferral principle, but if we are going to have a deferral, I would beg members to do it for one cycle and to resolve to do that, because if we really are in a position, as Mr. Wright suggested, that this issue can be resolved in one cycle, then that is, you know, if we go for a longer period and we are laying ourselves wide open to and vulnerable, and during that period, we will almost certainly face a very difficult situation. So I beg members to consider with deferring this to just one cycle.
If I may just add, I think if members are going down the road of deferral, then we're keen to move forward quickly, and I think having a one-cycle deferral will encourage all relevant parties to seek agreement quicker rather than slower, and I think that would be the preferred option, given the sentiments that have been expressed.
I'm happy to accept that point, but of course what I'm saying is that when Mr. Wright does come in the room, and bearing in mind the view taken by some members around this committee that agreement won't be easy to come by, and there were issues arising that might need further exploration, shall we say, would one cycle potentially be enough? That's why I revised my proposal based on the additional information we'd heard to have a slightly longer period, but with the ability to bring it back forward if a meeting can take place next week. If a meeting takes place next week and they decide that both councils decide they remain at loggerheads, then we'll come back in 3 weeks' time and we'll make a decision then. That's absolutely fine, as far as I can see. If there are issues that come out of that meeting that actually require a bit longer than 2 weeks by the time the agenda's published, sort of follow-up, then I want to give us the flexibility and the provision to allow that.
I think if we're looking at a longer period than one cycle, then my understanding is it would be more appropriate to consider an automatic deferral on the basis that that would allow the process to be considered in a timely manner because of the risk of costs, which is been clearly outlined.
When you say an automatic deferral, you mean not putting a time limit on at all? Just to be clear to everyone.
The automatic deferral is for one cycle.
That would apply if there was significant cost issues. So I'm going to ask Mr. Jarman whether he believes there could be a significant cost issue here which would require that or not. Yes, Heather.
Would it be possible, Chairman, to have a slight break? Because we're talking about some quite serious issues here.
I believe we need to. This is a matter of great financial import to the council on this, and we have to be consistent on the free applications. We can't. It's the same highway. We can't be different on